Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer, here today with Tim Royce, the president and CEO of the Canadian Automobile Dealer Association. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
Well, we're here today to talk about EV mandates and in particular the CADA's response to the federal government's EV mandates that came, and CADA and others are responding to. So now you've done a formal submission to, give your response, the association's response back. So tell us a bit about, at a high level, what those EV mandates are and why the CADA felt it was important to respond.
Sure. So the government recently, at the end of the year, published their intent to amend regulations involving passenger cars and light trucks emission regulations. What the proposal and the proposed regulations by the government would do is basically mandate certain percentages of EVs. What the government is suggesting is to go to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035, 60% by 2030, and the rate 20% by 2026. Now, as part of that intended regulation, the government has embarked on a consultation with industry and other players. And as part of that, we submitted our official response to the proposed regulation from our side and are explaining to the government the point of view of our over 3,400 members from across the country on their intended regulations and areas where said regulation needs to be substantially improved if Canada is to have a reasonable chance of actually achieving some of those percentages that the government is talking about.
Okay, and in the submission, it goes through a number of points. We're going to cover some of them here, but I think one of the things that came through loud and clear from your submission was this isn't just a dealership issue or even just a manufacturer issue. This is a societal-wide transformation, maybe a once-in-a-generation shift, and therefore involves like a lot of collaboration between governments and industry players, and the government can't necessarily just mandate this without all of that collaboration. So let's start, if you will, with consumer incentives, because even though manufacturers are busy planning and pipeline of introducing, all this great new product, the adoption rates are really still relatively low. We've seen other jurisdictions, even the CADA summit that you presented, earlier this year, where in another jurisdiction like Norway, with incentives and other things in place, the adoption took off to sky high levels, really. So what is the CADA really looking for the government to do in terms of its own incentives and really on that front?
As you correctly outlined, if this is to take place, it requires a full societal transformation on the path there. This is not us saying as this is the reality as it's expressed itself in other jurisdictions around the world. You mentioned Norway. We had a Norwegian dealer at a recent summit sort of explain what it's like for him to almost live in EV normality as a dealer. So sales last year in Norway, 85% were already zero emission vehicles. So, and this is the lessons that are being learned all around the world, that if you want to achieve this, you need to really approach it holistically and not just mandate something and then expect that and wish upon a star and then think it's going to happen. A lot of things are required on the path there. The first one being there needs to be adequate incentives offered for consumers to make the transition to these new vehicles, to this different technology, to this a disruption, quite frankly, in their lifestyles. And in order to make that transition, sufficient incentives have to be put on the consumer side financially to make that transition happen. Not for the early adopters that are already buying an electric vehicle today and say, they see what benefits they might have from it. They've already bought into that transition. But if we're truly trying to get to meaningful percentages in this country, it will take convincing a larger portion of the population, and we need to make the vehicles as attractive as currently internal combustion engines are. And that is what will be required for a certain period of time, not forever, but for a certain period of time, in order to move people away from their intended desire from an internal combustion engine to a mandated desire, is going to require some money, right? And this is where we're talking about the consumer incentives. And there the gap is still fairly high. especially compared to jurisdictions such as the US. The gap in certain provinces of Canada, from what we're currently seeing, is $7,000, quite frankly, between what they should be and what is currently on the table. That difference is obviously substantially lower in those provinces that already offer provincial incentives, such as Quebec and BC. But for all other jurisdictions in Canada, it's roughly around those $7,000 that we're looking at as a gap. And that will be required from our perspective for at least the next 4 to 6 years.
Well, the other thing, we've seen the impact of incentives in Ontario. There used to be a pretty robust incentive program here. EV sales started to uptick, and that was taken away. We saw an immediate decline. So there's no question there's a cause and effect, and incentives work, certainly, as you say, in the early stages of this transition. Right. The other issue, and let's pivot maybe to the next point, is really around public awareness. There's still a lot of concern, apprehension, misunderstandings really amongst the general public. I know the Toronto Auto Show this year, Canadian National Auto Show rather, had an EV test track, and had a lot of Canadians that were doing their first time ever being in an electric vehicle. So there is a need to really educate people about things like battery life and range anxiety and all these other things. What are you calling on the federal government to do to sort of help, and not just necessarily leave that just to industry alone to educate this great mass of society?
Yeah, that's exactly the shortcoming, if you will, of the current proposed regulation. It doesn't include anything around sort of an awareness campaign, if you will, for the general public. And it is the general public that you're trying to move in that direction. You're not trying to move somebody who's already made up his mind to go to an electric vehicle. You're trying to move society. You're trying to move consumers in that direction. So, and it can't be left up to industry alone and our members to be able to communicate and alleviate some of the concerns that each and every consumer has around, hey, what's the range of these things in cold climate? What do I do with charging? What do I do with this? What do I do with that? Now, a lot of those answers can be given at the dealership level, right? However, it would be extremely beneficial if there is a more massive approach to this, as in Canada is transforming its society in this direction. This is what will be required of you individuals, but this is what the government is doing for you, right? And these are the benefits that you will have as an individual consumer around these things. Rest assured, dear consumers, dear Canadians, that there will be enough charging infrastructure for these things. Also, you might be concerned about how do we generate our electricity, because it's about the total footprint, right, of emissions, not just about the footprint of the vehicle itself, but how do we produce our electricity? Do we have enough electricity? Do we have enough a grid capacity to take care of those things? Here are the investments that are foreseen on the path there, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things will be tremendously helpful in having those conversations, to have when a consumer comes in and you're having a conversation with them about potentially going from internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle engine, where it's not only the dealer trying to sell a product, but where the consumer already comes in with a mindset that has been predisposed by this awareness campaign of saying, listen, this is the right thing to do. We're moving as a country in this direction, et cetera, right? That's a very different conversation that you would have then with individual consumers around that.
Well, you hit on the next topic I want to touch on. So if you imagine now we've got these incentives on the hood of the vehicle that makes it more attractive and affordable. Now we've got a public education campaign that's driving them towards an inquiry. And now let's say they acquire one and they go out and they don't have a great experience because there isn't a charging infrastructure robust enough to support certainly the targeted amount of vehicles that are being mandated. Right. So it's a bigger issue. So maybe speak about what CADA is recommending and finding as the gap on the whole charging infrastructure side of the equation.
That is, from our perspective, the largest stumbling block or hurdle on the path to electrification. If you read our full submission document, you can see that we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort on that topic alone. What we've said from our side is very clearly, for this to be successful, people need to charge up where they live, work, and play, right? So at their home, at their place of work, and wherever they, so to speak, play, right? Their social clubs, churches, supermarkets, golf clubs, what have you, so that they can charge up in those situations. And unfortunately there, the proposed regulation falls woefully short of achieving any of those. the government seems to rely on solely public charging infrastructure, but even there, the amount of money being proposed for public charging infrastructure is nowhere near enough what it needs to be. So we structured our proposal to the government and our ideas around three specific topics on charging. The first one being, yes, public charging infrastructure. What will be truly required to make public charging infrastructure available? So from our estimation, in order to achieve 100% electrification in Canada, you would require 1.6 million public charging stations in Canada. By the way, operational charging stations. Okay, so those that actually work when you pull up to them and not, be defective 50% of the time, as is sometimes currently the case, right? So that's around public charging infrastructure. There, the differences of opinion are what will really be required, how much money will be required for these, what type of chargers should they be, level 2 chargers, level 3 chargers. And by the way, also within that, chargers need to start to be compatible. So something that works for a Nissan Leaf might not be the right charger for the high-end Porsche, for example, the Taycan, right? So there needs to be a differentiation of that as well in public charging infrastructure. Second piece, and the third piece, the second and the third piece combined are probably the most important one for us in Canada. Why? Because a large portion of Canadians live in multifamily settings, multifamily homes, condo buildings, etc. This is where our population is. By the way, this is a very big difference between us, for example, and Norway, what we heard from the Norwegian dealer that was at our summit, right? For them, public charging infrastructure is the way to go. Home charging wasn't that big of an issue because it can be resolved. Not that many families live in these multifamily settings that we have in Canada. Very different for us. So that needs to be addressed in large metropolitan areas. So think about Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Quebec City, right? Downtown Calgary. People live in condo buildings or they live in multifamily settings. So they need to be able to charge at their home. And that needs to be addressed in various ways. The first one being, that's the second proposal, taking care of infrastructure going forward. So the federal government to take a leadership role with provinces to work on, for example, things like building codes. Any building above a certain density going up, thou shalt have at least the pre-wiring done, right? Or the canals within the concrete before you pour it so that you can add later on include charging stations. It doesn't mean including charging stations in every building. It means the design has to incorporate it so that it's cheaper and easier to do once the building goes up. So that's already, by the way, being implemented in certain jurisdictions. So Richmond out in BC already implemented a change in their building codes about 5 or 6 years ago. Every single condo going up in Toronto right now, they're not building for that, right? And that's an easy thing to do. By the way, that doesn't cost any money. It just needs to take up the leadership from the politicians to do that. So that would take care of any new buildings from here until the future. And then the third and probably most important aspect is resources need to be dedicated to retrofit existing buildings in these cities to be able to accommodate charging. So far, unfortunately, the discussions we've had with the government around that and the charging in multifamily settings as well, they should then rely on the public charging infrastructure. What the government doesn't seem to realize, even though we're told on multiple occasions, if they say that, they're basically just added 45 minutes to everybody's daily commute. So how's that supposed to work? People will not accept that. If you tell them now, in order to change from your trusted internal combustion engine, you're going to go to an electric vehicle engine. Oh, and by the way, I just added half an hour, 45 minutes every day to your commute. They're going to say, thank you very much. No, thank you. So those were the main aspects of our submission. And again, we concentrated very heavily around charging infrastructure. The last proposal we made about charging infrastructure to the government as well is to make resources available for dealerships to install public-facing charging stations at their locations, right? Which can be very beneficial for customers as well and for all the communities.
Well, it's a great overview, Tim. You also, I know there's other things in there regarding fleets and scrappage programs and others. And the other point is CAD has obviously made a submission, but the other vehicle associations, the Global Automakers of Canada, Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, and even manufacturers have also made submissions. So let's hope out of that collective voice, reason prevails. The government's able to act on some of that wisdom. But thanks for sharing the dealer perspective with us today. So.
No, thanks, Todd. And as you mentioned, yes, the manufacturers as well have submitted something now. We are also working on a provincial level with the provincial governments on these topics, because they're also the provincial respects are very, very different. So just one example, we had recently a conversation with people from the government of Saskatchewan, right? Their reality is completely different, right? Their multifamily home settings are maybe not the biggest topic, but the extreme temperatures and the large distances that people have to travel. Oh, and by the way, if something happens on those distances in the middle of winter, well, it can be quite frankly a matter of life and death if a sufficient infrastructure is not available.
Be interesting to see the next steps, but at least the CAD has done its due diligence, as always, advocating for the dealer interests and adding to that debate. So appreciate your time with us here today to walk us through it.
Thank you very much, Todd. Take care.